Hey everybody, it's Mrs. Dumas, and today I'm going to talk to you about the DBQ, or the document-based essay question. This is an essay that you'll not only write in class, but also on the AP exam. So if you're ready, let's get started. So the DBQ is basically a prompt. The AP or College Board are going to ask you a prompt, and then you're going to answer that prompt using the 7 documents that they provide you. And they give you about 15 minutes to read and work the documents, which we'll talk a little bit later about, and then 45 minutes to actually write the essay. And then your essay will be scored using a 7-point rubric. And oftentimes, the beginning of the DBQ will look very similar to this, where they tell you what it is, what you need to have in your essay, and then follow it up with the prompt. Now, with the 7-point rubric, every single DBQ you write is going to be scored using this rubric, and the 7 points count for this. You can earn 1 point for contextualization, 1 point for thesis, up to 2 points for evidence, 1 point for sourcing, 1 point for evidence beyond the documents, and 1 point for complexity. We're actually going to go over the first 6 points today. The only point we're not going to go over is complexity, because I want to leave that to a later date. So let's first talk about contextualization, because it's the first thing you're going to write in your essay. And basically, contextualization is providing background information so that the reader of your essay isn't going into the essay going, what are we reading about? Who is this? You don't want them to feel like that as they're reading the essay. And so I think the best way to explain historical context is using those rolling intros in the Star Wars movies. Those are not just for show and they look really cool, and it was something that was really unique a long time ago. The purpose of those rolling intros is to give the viewer enough information to understand what's going on when the movie starts. So in the first Star Wars movie I saw was Episode 4, A New Hope, right? And had they just started the movie with this huge ship crawling across the sky, getting ready to board this tiny ship, we would have been like, what in the world is going on? Who's this ship? Why are we in space? Blah, blah, blah. But by providing that rolling intro, we have enough information to understand what's going on when the movie starts. And that's the same thing that historical contextualization is going to do for you and the reader of your essay. So we always recommend that contextualization is the first thing you write in your intro paragraph, and make sure that your contextualization doesn't start any more than a few hundred years prior to the dates specified on the prompt. Otherwise, it becomes obsolete. But we'll talk about more on that later. So let's take a look at an example, a modern day example. What background information would a person who was living in 2075, so not now, but 75 years from now, what kind of background information would they need to understand this picture, right? Day 1 without casinos. Check and raise you 3 rolls and a sanitizer. If a person saw this picture without any background information, without any context, they would be like, what in the world is going on? Why are those people wearing masks? Why are they betting toilet paper and hand sanitizer? So we would kind of need to give them a little bit of background information for people to understand this picture. So we'd say, hey, in 2020, there was this global pandemic with COVID-19, and it was pretty serious, and people had to wear masks so they wouldn't get infected. And then there was a run on all the stores. People were buying as much toilet paper and hand sanitizer as they could because they're freaking out about the pandemic. And so 3 weeks into the pandemic, nobody could find toilet paper and nobody could find hand sanitizer. That's why it was so valuable, and they're making a joke about betting it. So that's the background information they would need to understand this meme. Now, for historical context, we're asking you for background information regarding an historical event. So something might look like this. So, what historical background would a person need to understand your essay if your essay is about the Mongols conquering so much of Eurasia? So what's some background information we would want to provide them so they would have enough information to be able to read the rest of your essay and understand it? It probably would look something like that. We'd have to describe who the Mongols were. We definitely would want to explain what Eurasia was. and maybe then provide a little bit of info on how the Mongol Empire came about and how much of Eurasia did they conquer, right? Because we're always pretending we're writing to somebody who has no clue at all about what we're talking about. So if we could tell them, hey, by the way, here's who the Mongols are, here's what they conquered, here's how they became an empire, that would at least give them enough information to be able to read your essay and not have a ton of questions as they're reading it. So when you write your historical context, just keep that in mind. It's just enough background information, 3 to 4 sentences, that's going to help the reader understand what's going on in your essay. Then the next point you can earn is your thesis, and I know that you know what a thesis is. You've written a lot of them, but for the purpose of AP World History, your thesis must first be historically defensible. That means that the evidence in the documents have to be able to support what you write in your thesis. The other thing that you need to know is that your thesis cannot be overgeneralized and it needs to be specific. And I want to explain what that means in a little bit more detail with this slide. Okay, so let's say your prompt is analyze how the Mongol Empire impacted societies in Eurasia. So overgeneralized theses means theses that are super vague. You're like, no duh, right? And so here are a couple examples of overgeneralized theses. The Mongols had both a negative and positive effects on society in Eurasia, and the Mongols had strong impacts on trade and religion in Afro-Eurasia. Okay, so while those are correct, they are way, way too vague. AP is just basically going to be like, no kidding, that's why we asked you the prompt. Your thesis has got to be a lot more specific than that. So let's take those overgeneralized theses and let's try to make them a little bit more specific. And if we did that, they may look something like this. The Mongols impacted societies in Afro-Eurasia through increased violence, but also increased religious toleration. So that is a specific version of thesis number 1. The Mongols impacted Afro-Eurasian societies by increasing trade and also promoting religious tolerance. That's a more specific version of thesis number 2. So this is what AP is looking for right here at the bottom. They do not want to see overgeneralized theses. You will not earn credit for them. So make sure that your thesis is specific. And we are going to explain how to do that in another presentation. So after you're done with contextualization and after you're done with thesis, now it's time to start looking at the evidence points. And you can earn 2 evidence points for the DBQ. The first evidence point is the easiest point to earn on the entire DBQ. All you have to do to earn this point is provide evidence from 3 different documents that is somehow related to the prompt. So if your prompt is how the Mongols impacted Eurasia, all you have to do is find evidence in 3 documents that somehow connects to either the Mongols or Eurasia. It doesn't even have to do a good job supporting your thesis. It just has to relate to it. Easiest point ever to get. Usually everybody gets this point. Now, one key piece of advice. For AP World History in the DBQ, you must paraphrase your evidence. You cannot use direct quotes. If you use direct quotes from a document, AP will not give you credit. It must be paraphrased. I cannot stress that enough. It happens every single year where students write a really good DBQ, but they don't get points for evidence because they use direct quotes. Do not direct quote. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. So what evidence in this document shows how the Mongols affected society in Eurasia? So this is a selection from the Novgorod Chronicles. It's basically a document written by Russian religious authorities from the city of Novgorod, which is in 1238, which is pretty close to the time that the Mongols, invaded Russia. So what I want you to do is take a few minutes and I want you to read this document and then pick out what evidence you think best could answer the prompt, how did the Mongols affect societies in Eurasia? So pause this video, read the document, find the evidence, and we'll come back in about a minute. Okay, so let's take a look at this. If we're looking for evidence that shows that the Mongols impacted or affected societies, What evidence in this document relates to that? Well, there are a couple different things. If you go to the top of the document here, where the Mongols demanded 1/10 of everything, okay, that could be how they impacted, but that's really just more of a question. The better evidence that supports how the Mongols affected societies is down here when they talk about how the Mongols, who the Russians call Tartars, took over the village, killed everybody, blah, blah, blah. So that evidence is the best one. Now, we can't use a direct quote. So if we took from this point on, the Tartars took the town all the way to the bottom, how can we take that direct quote and paraphrase it? Well, it could look something like this. The Tartars entered the village and slaughtered men, women, and children by burning them, by stabbing them. They also raped women and girls. And so that's a way for me to take that entire quote and I paraphrased it. I'm still basically saying what the quote said. I'm just putting it in my own words. They entered the village, they slaughtered men and women, they burned them, they stabbed them, they raped women and girls. So that's my paraphrased version of the evidence found in the document. And that's what you need to do when you provide evidence from the documents in the DBQ. Hopefully that makes more sense to you. So the way to earn the second evidence point in a DBQ is when you are able to not only select the best evidence from the document that supports what you're trying to prove in your thesis, you also explain it in a little bit more detail. So evidence point 1, as long as the evidence that you presented related somehow to the Mongols in Eurasia, even if it didn't support your thesis at all, that still gets you the point. The second point is harder to earn because this is where you have to bring in the best evidence from the document to support your thesis, and you have to do a little explaining with it. So let's take a look at a sample. So evidence part 2. So this source is a picture. It's showing Marco Polo, an Italian merchant who spent 17 years in Kublai Khan's court, which was obviously in China, and this is him traveling the Silk Road. Okay, so if your essay is arguing that the impact of the Mongols on Eurasia was increased trade, you somehow have to find the best piece of evidence in this picture that supports it. Okay? So the first thing we need to do is ask ourselves, what is this pic showing? Well, when I look at it, I see camels, I see horses. One of those guys obviously is Marco Polo. It looks like they're on cobblestones or desert. I don't know. I don't know who exactly is traveling with Marco Polo, but if it's along the Silk Road, I'm guessing it's probably merchants. So that's what I see in the picture. Now, what evidence could I use from this pic that's going to support a thesis that said the Mongols increased trade in Afro-Eurasia? Well, that's a tough one, but I could use that Marco Polo's on it. We know that he's European. There seems to be a lot of camels. There seems to be a lot of people. So that's the evidence I could use to support that trade increased as a result of the Mongols, So what I could say is in this pic, one sees Marco Polo traveling the Silk Road with a caravan of camels and other merchants. Okay, that's true. But that evidence alone doesn't show that the Mongols increased trade. That just shows that on the Silk Road, there are caravans of camels and Marco Polo. Here's where I have to do a little bit more explaining as to how this shows that more trade was happening because of the Mongols. So all I need to do is add a little bit more explanation. This suggests that Europeans began trading along the Silk Road during Mongol rule, which indicates more than just Asians were using the route, leading to more trade. So it's not a complicated statement. It's not like hugely in depth, but it does explain how that evidence shows how the Mongols led to more trade. So evidence point number 2 is much harder to get, but it is totally doable as long as you are picking out the best evidence from the documents that support your thesis and explaining that evidence in a little bit more detail. And that's how you earn evidence point number 2. So now we've got the context point, we've got the thesis point, we've got 2 evidence points, so we're up to 4 points. How do we earn points 5 and 6? Let's take a look. Point 5 is called evidence beyond the document. And in your DBQ essay, one time you must provide at least one piece of evidence that can't be found in any of the documents that's going to help prove your argument or help prove your thesis, right? And so this piece of information has to come from your brain. It cannot be found in any of the documents you have or the background information they give you. This is something that comes from your historical knowledge. And also, your evidence beyond the document, or your EBD, must be in the same time period as the prompt. So it can't be before the time period, it can't be after the time period. So let's take a look on how to do that. So we've already used this image. We know that we're using this image to show increased trade along the Silk Road as a result of the Mongols. And in the previous slide, we've talked about the evidence we saw in the document and how that led to increased trade, right? So now, how would we add a piece of evidence beyond the document that could continue to support our argument? So let's say we've given the picture, we've given the explanation statement to earn the evidence points. Now we can earn something like this, or add something like this, which will help give us the evidence point. Marco Polo was an Italian merchant who traveled the Silk Road seeking access to new knowledge and goods that he could share with Europe. Increased safety and trade along the Silk Road helped him accomplish this, right? So the information we have in that section, that is not coming from the documents or anything in the DBQ, that came from my brain. I explained who he was, and then in the bold, I explained how him being on the Silk Road does show increased trade and helped him accomplish his goal. So that's a piece of evidence beyond the document that I'm adding to the DBQ to continue to support or prove my argument that trade increased along the Silk Road as a result of the Mongols. So you only need to do this once in your essay. We always recommend you do it twice, just a little CYA, right? But a couple pieces of historical knowledge that comes from your brain that's going to help prove what you're writing in your thesis and your essay. And that's how you earn point number 5. Now, point number 6 is one of the hardest points to earn in the DBQ. It is your sourcing point. So let's explain that in a little bit more detail. This is basically the analysis part of your essay. You can totally earn it. It's not as hard as people make it out, but you've got to follow some very simple but direct steps. When you source a document, you're actually digging deep into it. You're going beyond the surface level of main idea or finding evidence. So when you source a document, you're basically explaining what the document is saying and why. And that's the why part that is so hard. So when you go to source a document, you can source it in 3 different ways. You can source it for historical situation, for purpose, or for POV. So let's explain those in a little bit more detail. Ooh, color change. That's because this is really important. When you source a document or analyze a document for historical context, you're trying to explain what was going on during the time period in which the document was written that might be influencing what the author is saying. So basically, what's going on during the time period that is influencing what the author has either written or painted or drawn or whatever else. Okay? Purpose is, what is the reason the document was created? What was the objective of the author when he or she wrote or painted this document, right? What did they hope to accomplish? What was their goal? POV is the author's point of view, which means their attitude or way of looking at something. When you're doing POV, you not only want to identify what the POV is, what's the attitude, but why does the author have this attitude? And then finally, you can do audience. It's not my favorite, but they do accept it. Basically, you're explaining who is this document being written to, or who is this document appealing to, and why is that the audience? Why did the author want those people to be the audience? So when you go to source or analyze a document, you pick one of these to source the document with. So let's look at some examples. So we're going to use the same document we've used in the past. Again, the document where the Mongols go into Russia and they kill and slaughter and rape a lot of people, and it's horrible. We know that this document was written by religious Russian authorities around 1238. So if we're sourcing for historical situation, what we have to do is explain what's going on during the time period okay, that helps explain what we read in the document. So historical situation for this specific document may look something like this. Russia was one of the first areas that the Mongols invaded in the early 1200s. Their goal was to test out their war machine and see how effective it was in conquering nations, and it was quite successful in Russia. So basically, I've given some background information to explain what was going on when this document was written, to help explain what was going on in the document, right? The historical situation. That's all you need to do. What's going on during the time period that's explaining what the author wrote. Pretty simple. Now, if we go to source a document for purpose, and remember, purpose is what is the author's goal for having written this document, that's what we're looking for. So once again, same document, Russian people slaughtered, the Russian religious authorities basically portray this horrible slaughter, and let's look at what a purpose statement could be. The purpose of this document was to show the brutality of the Mongols and possibly warn others to avoid the same fate by surrendering. That would be a legit purpose statement. The Russians make the Mongols seem horrific, which they were in some cases, horrific in this document. He's talking about how this Russian village didn't surrender and this is what the Mongols did. Well, there's a reason the authors wrote this, right? And it's not just to inform the people about what the Mongols did. It's never just to inform. There's got to be another reason. And a possible reason could be that they're trying to warn others that if you don't surrender, this is going to happen to you. And so when you're doing purpose, remember, it's not just to inform. Purpose is usually to persuade. So what is the author trying to persuade you of? And that's what you do with purpose. Then finally, there is POV, point of view. And once again, when you source a document for point of view, you want to tell the reader what is the author's attitude and why does the author have that attitude or perspective. All right, so same document again. Here's what a POV statement could look like. This document was written by Russian religious figures. They paint the Mongols as horrid figures, and this makes sense because it was the Russians who were slaughtered, and the religious officials were angry and devastated by what the Mongols did, so they wanted to show how awful the Mongols were. Okay, and so in this POV statement, I explained what the attitude or what the perspective was, that the Mongols were horrid. Okay. Now I go on in the rest of this to explain why these Russian religious authorities might think the Mongols were horrid. Because they were devastated by what the Mongols did to this Russian village, and they wanted to show how awful the Mongols were. So again, POV statement is, what's the author's attitude or perspective? Why does the author have that attitude or perspective? And so, as we wrap up, if you do all those things, have a good historical context to start your essay, have a nice, solid, specific thesis, support that thesis with good evidence from the documents and a little bit of explanation, add one piece of evidence beyond the document, do some sourcing, then that could easily earn you at least a 6 out of 7 on the DBQ. That 7th point, complexity, we're going to talk about a little later. So thanks for joining me today. As always, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, or feedback, do not hesitate to contact me and give me those. And other than that, we'll see you next time.